Here we have the iPhone 12 Pro Max, the Sony Xperia 1 Mark III, and the S21 Ultra. And today we are going to do a camera comparison, a very comprehensive one, between these three devices. Just to answer some of the questions my subscriber raised in my previous videos, I'm not going to use the manual mode at all in this comparison. I'll keep them on full auto. As for low light shots, I'll turn on the night mode on Samsung. And as for iPhone 12 Pro Max and Sony Xperia 1 Mark III, they'll auto-detect the low light scene and switch on the night mode as well. So that means night mode for all these smartphones in low light situations. And I'll not do any post-editing of the photos. So these are all photos straight out from the camera. And the reason I'm doing that is because I believe 99% of the customers are going to use their smartphone cameras this way. So if you are so professional that you shoot RAW and then you do all the editing in Lightroom or Photoshop, then maybe this review is not for you. Okay, so I guess that's clear, and let's go to the comparisons. Okay, let's look at the first set of samples from the main lens at a bright light condition. And the Sony is in the middle. I feel the exposure is a little bit dark, right? The iPhone and Samsung are more balanced. And if you zoom in, you can see that the Sony is a little bit blurry, while the Samsung and Apple are a bit sharper. But the difference is not huge here. Right, let's move on to next set of photos. In this set, the Sony become the brightest. So you see there is a little bit of inconsistency about the auto exposure here. And then zooming in, this time the Sony is very blurry. I don't know why. And the Samsung and Apple are quite consistently sharp. And then we move on to the mid-range zoom. So it's 3x on Samsung, 2.9x on Sony, and 2.5x on iPhone. The exposure is a little bit different. iPhone and Samsung are very similar, while the Sony is a little bit darker. And zooming in for details, it seems that the Sony is still not as sharp as Samsung and Apple. This next set of samples are from the 10x lens. At first glance, they look quite similar, but zooming in, you see that the Samsung is super sharp. You can even read the plate number on that motorcycle, while the Sony is a little bit blurry. It's not as sharp as Samsung, and the iPhone is the worst in this case. Another set of 10x zoom samples. Samsung is still the sharpest, and Sony follows, and the iPhone is the worst in this case. And I think that's expected because Samsung has the best periscope zoom lens, and Sony can only go up to 4.4 times, while iPhone stops at 2.5. Then moving on to slightly more challenging indoor situations. I think in this photo, they all look quite similar to each other. It's just a matter of preference for the different colors. And zooming in, we don't see much difference either. Then moving on to this next set of high contrast scene from the main lens. I feel the Samsung and Apple are a little bit more balanced here. If you check the highlight and the shadow, they can maintain the exposure a little bit better. And then zooming in, you can see that the Samsung is slightly sharper than the Apple. So I think in this case, Samsung is the best, followed by Apple, and Sony lacks a little bit of balance in the exposure here. Okay, next set is of dusk scene. So the light is not so-called low light, but the light is not that ideal. In this case, I personally prefer the way that Samsung handles this scene. It feels brighter and the colors are more pronounced. And zooming in, we see that the Sony still lacks a little bit of sharpness in this shot. Okay, in the next set of shots, there isn't much difference in terms of details and the exposure, but I guess the white balance differs a little bit here, and I prefer the approach of Samsung and Sony here. And I feel that Apple make the white balance a little bit too cool for my liking. And then in this next shot, the iPhone is showing a little bit of issue here. I feel this time is too warm, right? And for Sony, it's a little bit cool. And I feel that Samsung is striking the right balance here. It's not too warm or too cool, so it looks quite comfortable to me. And then zooming in for the details, Sony again is being a little bit softer than the other two. And here is another set of 3x zoom shot in indoor lighting setup. And I feel that the Samsung and Apple are sharp, while the Sony is a little bit soft. And I also tried a couple of portrait shots from these cameras, and I think in terms of the accuracy, none of them are perfect. You can see some imperfections in the shots, especially at the branches and leaves where things are very complex. But one thing I noticed is that the Samsung and Apple are able to handle the exposure very well, even in portrait mode, while the Sony cannot seem to do so. So you can see that the sky are all blown out in both of these sets of portrait shots. Then in this next set of photos of my dog, I feel the iPhone is really lacking here. It makes my dog look very dirty and messy. I don't know how to describe, while the Sony and Samsung are doing quite well here. And then in this next two sets of ultra-wide angle shots in bright daylight, I think they are all pretty similar. Okay, there are some difference in terms of the color balance, the exposure, but I think it's pure personal preference. There's no real winner or loser in this case, except the fact that the Apple and Samsung are slightly wider than Sony. And then there's one nice thing about Samsung that Sony and Apple cannot do is micro. So the ultra-wide angle on Samsung S21 Ultra can do very close micro shots. Like in this case, you can see how close Samsung can get to the flower, while the best Sony and Apple can do is just like the ones on the right. There is just no competition. And here is another example, just to show you how close Samsung can get to the subject. And of course, you can zoom in on Sony and iPhone to do sort of a fake micro shot, right? But then the detail preservation just cannot compare with Samsung. So a good sum up for Samsung for giving us this very nice macro ultra-wide angle lens. And lastly, let's see a few food shots. And in this case, the Sony actually gave me a pleasant surprise. So the Xperia 1 Mark III can actually take some very decent food shots. Just look at all these shots. I think the exposure, the color, everything is quite well maintained, and I would say that this food look quite attracting from the photos of the Sony. And personally, I feel the Samsung shots are quite good as well, while the iPhone shots are lacking a little bit of attractiveness. It seems that the iPhone doesn't know how to handle the colors on food, and yeah, so that's Apple for you. Alright, now let's move on to low light scenarios, and this is where Sony falls behind. As you can see from this first set of shots from main lens, the Sony is just like 2 steps darker than the Samsung and Apple. The whole photo is just too dark, right? It is almost unusable at all. While the shots from Samsung is quite sharp and bright, and the highlight detail preservation is also great. And the one on iPhone is also pretty good, although not as sharp as Samsung. And Sony is just doing a very bad job here. Then in this next shot, you can see there is a very strange reddish hue from the Sony in the sky, and also the details are just very smudgy. And then in this next set of shot, you can see that the Sony is darker, and there is more overexposure in the highlight area, and also you can see a little bit of blurriness, so it's just not as sharp, not as good as Samsung and Apple. And moving on, we see that Samsung is really doing a fantastic job about the highlight preservation. So you see the signboard, so there is just no overexposure on Samsung at all, while the Sony and iPhone struggles to keep any detail in place. And then in this next shot, the Sony again is too dark and there is just no detail. And I think Samsung preserved the colors pretty nicely. iPhone sits in between, is okay, but it's not great. Move on to next set of shots. Samsung is again doing a wonderful job of highlight preservation. You see the highlights, there is plenty of detail, and Sony is just doing a very bad job here. There's no detail in the darker areas, there is no detail in the highlights, so everything is either underexposed or overexposed. And Apple again is somewhere in between. And then in this next shot, Sony again really cannot make it. It's just too dark. I think it did activate the night mode, but this is maybe the best it can do, right? So yeah, that's Sony for you. And then let's move on to 3x zoom at low light. And I feel that Samsung and Apple still takes the lead over Sony in this use case. So usually the Sony is either underexposed or has some strange hue, or the detail preservation is not good, like it's just not sharp enough. So all these are quite clear in this set of samples. These are all from the 3x zoom lens. I mean 2.9x on the Sony and 2.5x on the Apple. And when we move on to higher zoom levels, like 10x in this case, Samsung clearly takes the lead because it has a 10x periscope lens. Sony is actually a little bit better than Apple here because after all, it has the 4.4x, right? While Apple can only do 2.5x. And I feel when you are doing zoom shots, right, the Samsung just is miles ahead the other two competitors. The 10x periscope zoom lens really do magic here. So it basically is sharper, the colors are better, and the exposures are more balanced in almost every shot if you go to high zoom levels. And moving on to ultra wide angle, like the low light scenes, this is where Samsung really takes the lead. You can see that the Samsung is just brighter, it has more details, the colors are richer, so it's just an overall better photo from Samsung. Apple is, it doesn't have much detail, and the exposure looks a little bit dark, and the color is dull, while from Sony, usually you can just get a completely useless image if you are doing ultra wide at low light scenarios. Unless the scene is not as dark, it's properly lit by, say, all these street lights, then you can get a barely usable image from Sony, but if you pick the details, it's still behind Apple and Samsung. And one last thing I want to mention about Sony is that in low light scenarios, the viewfinder experience is pretty bad. As you can see from this example, the viewfinder from Samsung and Apple are pretty clear and sharp and has nice colors, while the one on Sony is clearly not as good. So this is just something I noticed. Alright guys, so basically that's all I want to show you. It took a lot of time and effort to make this comprehensive camera comparison, and I hope this video helps you in one way or another. And I think at this point the conclusion is quite clear. If you are just an average smartphone customer and who cares about photos, right, who sometimes take some casual shots from your smartphone, and you come and ask me, hi golden reviewer, should I buy the Xperia 1 Mark III? My answer is a clear no. It's very apparent that this device cannot provide the same level of camera quality or experience as Samsung and Apple gives you. And it doesn't help either to consider that this device costs $1,200. At that price, you might as well just get an S21 Ultra or iPhone 12 Pro Max. Well, I'm not saying that there's nothing good about this device at all, right? So the form factor is nice, the display is also quite nice, and sometimes the camera, it can produce some good results as well, but most of the time it's just a hit and miss. So maybe 1 or 2 times out of 10 you get some decent or amazing shot, but for 8 or 9 times out of 10 your shot will just be underwhelming and just not as good as your friends who is using a Samsung or Apple. So why do you waste money on this, right? And then I think there has to be these comments down below who says, oh, this is a device for the pros, you are just not good at taking photos, you don't know anything about photography, so you are just a noob, so don't review this phone. That's fine, I can accept such claims, and I mean my review is just for the average consumer, right? So if you are going to spend half an hour to adjust all the parameters and put your phone onto a tripod and take the raw shot and then later go back home to tweak in Photoshop or Lightroom, then I think you don't have to watch my review. You have your own ideas, you know photography well enough, so you don't need to listen to me. Just go ahead and buy whatever you like, right? But for the average consumer who do not want to waste your hard-earned money on this rubbish, I have to say that stay away from this device. Listen to me and thank me later. Or you can choose not to listen to me and throw your money into this thing and regret later. Remember, I'm not taking sponsorship from any manufacturer. I'm just trying to help you to pick the correct smartphone for you. and not waste money. Okay, so that's all for this video. Thanks for watching. If you find this helpful, please share it to your friends or community, and also don't forget to hit the subscribe button if you haven't. And see you next time.